Good morning, everybody. This is True Seeker. Um, I thought I'd do a series of videos that kind of go back to my origins, I guess. When you talk about religion, religious origins. And I know that I've talked a lot about Watchtower. I've mentioned, I've gone through Watchtower statistics and but I haven't talked a lot about Bible students. And I think there's some misconception about the Bible students. I don't think that too many people really understand who they are, what they are as a religion. I think people, especially former Jehovah's Witnesses, even active Jehovah's Witnesses, know a little something about the Bible students. They believe them to be early Jehovah's Witnesses. Many do. And that Jehovah's Witnesses is simply just an identifier or a name change for the movement as it matured. But that's not exactly the truth. That's what Watchtower would have members believe. And I think that there's a kind of a misunderstanding, even among Jehovah's Witnesses that know that the Bible students still exist today. Um, I think that they, and rightly so, they're focusing in on their own heritage. They're focusing in on the abuses of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, and there are 8 million Jehovah's Witnesses, and so there are a lot of people who suffered at the hands of the governing body, their policies, the abuses of the Watchtower, its belief systems. So I think that it's natural that people, activists, focus in on the big fish, really. Even though the big fish are relatively small religions when you compare them to Islam and Catholicism, they're big enough to be on the radar, and they're big enough to be on the radar of a lot of people, like atheists. Jehovah's Witnesses often are the brunt of jokes. Saturday Night Live used to have this joke about the land shark, and they would incorporate Jehovah's Witnesses into that, and knocking on the door, the land shark trying to get in. So it's there's a kind of, I guess, because of the strangeness, the oddness, the full devotion that is associated with being a Jehovah's Witness, causes people to look at the absurd and emphasize the absurd when in reality it's a very abusive religion. And the Jehovah's Witnesses have a fairly large revolving door. There must be tens of thousands who leave every year. Their growth rate barely, if we can believe anything about the numbers whatsoever, the growth rate barely keeps above the decline, the shrinkage. They're growing at a snail's pace, basically, and 1%, 1.5% a year, which is basically the same as the birth rate. But there is very little, if any, activism done with regard to the Bible students. And that's my heritage. That's where my background, my beliefs as I was raised to understand the world. It was through the Bible students movement, and I think because of the fact that they are so small, they fly under the radar. They don't grab many people's attention. Are they damaging? Yes. Are they a cult? Yes, they are. And they've done tremendous psychological damage to many, many individuals. I've mentioned this before of the 100 or so kids that I grew up with in the 60s, 70s. I know 3 of them who have committed suicide. I've been out of touch for a while, so there could have been more. I don't know. I know for a fact there were 3, and my brother was one of them. My middle brother, and that speaks a heck of a lot when you stop and you think that's 3%. 3%. And when you're talking about suicide rate, you're talking like 0.1%. We're talking orders of magnitude above the average suicide rate. Now, I know the suicide rate's increasing. People are concerned about it. And there's some different ideas on it. And but I think that evidences something about the Bible students that is not right. And it goes back to what they teach and how they make you feel about yourself. And so I think that it's important. And I think that there is a fair amount of misunderstanding. I've known a number of people who came out of the Jehovah's Witnesses to join the Bible students while I was a Bible student, and the misconception is that the Bible students are more open, more loving, more free. They'll tell you that the Bible students will call you brother, even though you may express something a little different, that you can think more freely in the Bible students, and they will still love you with unconditional love. But I think that there's some misunderstanding. And I think it's slightly because of the very restrictive culture that Jehovah's Witnesses have come from in terms of beliefs and what they're allowed to believe. And it's really not that terribly different from among the Bible students, because there are certain beliefs within the Bible students that are sacred and draw the line for considering one a brother. And a number of them would be, I can name a number of them right off the bat. If you don't call Brother Russell, for one thing, if you call him Russell, that's a marker right there. That cues a Bible student in that you don't have the proper respect for Charles Taze Russell. You always addressed him as Brother Russell or Pastor Russell, but you always addressed him. You never said Russell. Russell was a marker that you were from the outside, or you're inside heading out. So that's one. And that's not even doctrinal. That's just because of the reverence, the worshiping that Bible students, they essentially worship. In fact, Rutherford's biggest complaint regarding Russell was the Bible students. The Bible students' reverence, extreme reverence of Charles Taze Russell, and he said he was going to completely quash creature worship, and he was successful. He went to the extreme. He abolished birthdays and holidays and all kinds of celebrations and Christmas, and so. He got rid of Mother's Day because that's creature worship. So the Jehovah's Witnesses went, the pendulum swung in the other direction. Bible students adored the adoration of Charles Taze Russell as being the Laodicean messenger, a special messenger of God, and then to completely eliminating any kind of celebration of the human state whatsoever. So that's one. Another is if you said that Adam and Eve didn't deserve a resurrection, because that gets right down to the cornerstone doctrine of the ransom, which the Bible students hold sacred. Another doctrine, set of doctrines, would be the covenants. I don't know how much feuding there was over whether or not we were the 144,000 were under the new covenant or under the covenant of grace, as represented by Sarah and Sarah and Hagar and Keturah represented the three covenants. Russell made a big deal about that. Around 1909, he made a change. Up until 1909, he was teaching that the new covenant was in effect, and a number of Bible students, I think it was key, P.S.L. Johnson was key in this, that the church was not developed under the new covenant, but was under the covenant of grace, and it was under what Sarah represented, the covenant of grace. Abraham represented God. Sarah represented the covenant arrangement, and Hagar was the handmaiden slave and represented the old law covenant. And natural Israel was represented by Ishmael, and true Israel, or the 144,000, the spiritual Israel, was represented by Isaac. Isaac. And so, if you expressed anything other than what Russell taught in 1909 on about the covenants, you would find yourself out. My uncle did, who was a prominent Bible student, changed his mind. And maybe they've lightened up a little bit on that one, but that was a big one, especially during the 70s and 80s. If you didn't believe like Russell taught from 1909 on, then you were out of the truth. There were other key doctrines that set people apart from being in the truth or out of the truth. So, that and they weren't very what you would call critical things. They were very peculiar to the Bible students. They were very peculiar beliefs to Russell. And so there's a degree of intolerance. I think the line is drawn a little differently for Bible students, mainly because there's so few of them, and so they're willing to keep some degree of cohesiveness. So in order to do so, they're probably a little bit more willing, maybe today, to accept slightly different interpretations on a scripture than what Russell may have expressed. But if you said that Russell was not the wise and faithful servant, or he was the Laodicean messenger, I think you'd find yourself out of the Bible students movement pretty quickly, especially if you altered the doctrine of the ransom. That's the cornerstone belief of the Bible students. And I think that was the trigger for a lot of Bible students in the 1930s when Rutherford said that Adam and Eve weren't coming back and resurrection. That's what did it for my grandfather, and that's how I found out. That was a time marker for me. When I found out when that doctrinal change took place within Watchtower, that's when my family left the Watchtower, left association with the Watchtower, and that was sometime in the late 1930s, I think around 1937. And I think that was true for a lot of Bible students. There was a period of time through the 20s and through the 30s where there was a pretty large mass exodus of the original Bible students from Watchtower. About a quarter remained. William Schnell estimated 75% left. A lot of these were regathered after 1932 by Norman Woodworth, who was the first cousin of Clayton Woodworth, editor of the Golden Age magazine, also the writer of the 7th volume. He wrote it with George Fisher. But anyways, who are the Bible students? Who is this movement? And I'm going to kind of delve into that in a couple of videos, series of videos, and I think that it's important to really kind of go through this to address them. I mean, that's my heritage, and I want people to understand. If they don't agree or don't focus on this as an abuse of religion, at least I want them to understand what they were. And I mean, I belong to one of the more prominent families in the Bible students movement. I'm certainly a black sheep now, and I've had very little contact with family who are still in the Bible students, and I have a lot of family who are still in the Bible students. They don't show much interest in talking to me, and I'd feel rather uncomfortable being in their presence and talking with them, mainly because there's nothing to talk about. Bible students only talk about the Bible students. They only talk about the truth. There is nothing else that they're interested in. They won't. I mean, they may have some hobbies, but or maybe, let's say, interest in football or sports or something. But that they actually are made to feel guilty about it, and then they they'll watch a college football game, and then they'll focus in all the more on their devotion and consecration because they let the world slip in too much. And so they guilt trip themselves a lot. So who are these Bible students? And I'm going to give it to you from a Bible student perspective, because Watchtower acknowledges the existence of the Bible students, but they need continuity. They need legitimacy, and that's one of the things that that they don't have, because they basically, Joseph Rutherford usurped and stole, hijacked the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society to his own end, to his own purpose, and changed key doctrines and turned it into a money-making machine and into a global religion that has very tight control over the members. And so, we know a lot about Jehovah's Witnesses. In fact, there are tens of thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses that leave the witnesses every year. I mean, it's one, as a revolving door religion, it's probably the highest when you talk about percentage of people leaving. Their growth rate barely keeps above the flat line or shrinking, if we can believe the numbers. They're growing at about 1.5% to 2% a year, which is about the same as the birth rate. There are many thousands of witnesses who are leaving every year, and if you don't believe me, I've done a video on the numbers. I've done my own analysis. It's pretty much the same as what Paul Grundy has done. You could go to J.W. Facts. He also has a YouTube channel where he goes through the numbers. Paul is a very number crunching guy, and he goes through the growth rates and the numbers that they publish, that the Watchtower publishes. So he concurs that there are many thousands that leave every year. I think we came out with pretty close estimates. It's in the order of tens of thousands, in the low tens of thousands. So, the Bible students have a long history. And, some people started at William Miller. They weren't really Bible students. Although the Second Adventists had a strong influence on the Bible students movement, they were not Second Adventists. The Bible students really did not have any tie in a continuous sense. Russell was not a follower of William Miller, who began the Adventists. Neither was his father. Russell and his father, Joseph Little, and I will insert a picture here, began as Presbyterians originally. Joseph Little also was a member of the Masons, and I guess they were devout for the period. I mean, everybody was religious in those days, so you belonged to some religion. There was nothing akin to an atheist movement, really, during that period of time in the 1850s when Charles Russell was born, for them to believe in. Here's a later picture of Charles Russell that obviously he it's not it's toward the end of his life in the latter years, but was one little interesting fact here I'm just going to interject is that Russell and his father married sisters. They were brothers-in-law, and that is kind of a strange situation. But had a haberdashery. He was they sold clothing, and Charles got involved in the business as a young boy, really. He talked about having been incorporated into the business at the age of 12. But they were, I guess, fairly good businessmen. But they certainly weren't religious fanatics at the time. They attended church. Apparently, Russell's mother was deeply religious, but she died when he was about 9 years old. And Russell, I guess, kind of struggled in his faith. I guess he had questions even as a boy. He had questions, and so he rather than accept the Presbyterian teachings, he just kind of dropped them and went off on his own. I guess his father didn't really have very strong devout feelings for his Presbyterianism either. He became a Bible student later on and followed his son, essentially. His son must have had a very domineering personality, because typically a father doesn't follow a son into things, but Joseph Little did. Around 1870, after Russell had some questions regarding his faith, he had a chance encounter with an Adventist preacher, Jonas Wendell, and that changed his whole attitude about the Bible. From having rejected the Bible, saying, at least he claimed that this was the case, that he had rejected the Bible, even investigated Eastern religions, whatever investigated means, and then at some point even gave up belief in the Bible. This encounter with Jonas Wendell really changed Russell's outlook, and he began a Bible study, and he began to look at the Bible sort of as a Da Vinci Code, that there was an underlying meaning behind what you read on the surface, that the key to unlocking the truth that was hidden, the hidden truth of the Bible, sort of like ancient aliens. You have to look for the clues. He had that kind of a mind. I mean, Russell was influenced by guys like Charles Piazzi Smythe, they're basically conspiracy theorists. That's really the temperament. That's the kind of mind that a person like that has. And so Russell thought the Bible was this mysterious book that God had hidden truths in, and that if one was sincere and prayed heavily and was honest about seeking the hidden truths in the Bible, that God would open up the windows of heaven, and the light would come pouring in, and you would understand the Bible, and it would harmonize. And so he began a little Bible study group. There were about 5 of them. His father was one of them. George Storrs was an early influence. He met with them. And then through the 1870s, let's see, Russell would have been 20 in 1872. So he was about 18 when he first started this Bible study. And you see what I'm saying? What father is going to follow an 18-year-old? I know my father wouldn't. No way. But anyway, the Bible study group continued, and it didn't grow, but they put together what they felt was a cohesive set of doctrines that the Bible taught, and they looked at things such as hell, which bothered Russell and a number of Adventists. The idea of hell was problematic to him, that a loving God really couldn't burn people in eternal torture forever and ever. Amen. So he rejected that and looked at all the scriptures that proved that there was no hell. And then they looked at the idea of the ransom and restitution, dispensationalism, that there were specific periods of time that God, worked under covenant or relationships with certain peoples. There was the pre-Diluvian period before the flood, and then there was the what he called the world that now is. The world that was the period before the flood, the 1650 some odd years they claimed that existed before the flood, and then the present evil world, in which God had selected Israel to be a special nation. And they put together the core of the belief systems of the Bible students movement today. The key thing lacking was the chronology, and that didn't come till a little later in the 1870s, when Russell, by chance, got a hold of a tract or brochure of some of the writings of Nelson Barbour. Now, Barbour was another Adventist. He had was an independent person who apparently had been a follower of William Miller, as was George Storrs. But Storrs didn't really go into the chronological end of things as much as Barbour. Barbour really looked at the chronology very deeply. That was something that was really his focus, and that captured Russell's attention. Now, Russell was already beginning to look in terms of I'm gonna put this up. Began to look in terms of chronological. There's no such thing as multitasking, and studies have shown that people can only focus in on one thing at a time and do one thing at a time. Maybe that's a little dark, but at least I don't have the sun in my eyes. So, there was a sort of a convergence at that point between what Russell was heading towards and where Barbour was. And so it captured Russell's attention. They were beginning to look into some of the chronological aspects, and dispensationalism is a part of the chronology. And so they put together a kind of an overview of God's plan from a chronological perspective. And they came up with what they called the plan of the ages. Now, at this point, I will insert the plan of the ages as I grew up with it. This is a copy of the plan of the ages that was a fold out in every first volume, Studies of the Scriptures, Divine Plan of the Ages. And this is a little bit more elaborate than the very early versions of the dispensations. If you look at the book, The Three Worlds, that was a collaboration between Nelson Barbour and Russell. you'll see a cruder version of this where the larger arcs, where you see dispensation first, dispensation second, dispensation third, those were the key arcs or periods. That these arcs represent periods of time and time passage in a chronological sense. And then Russell looked at sub periods of time and added them as subordinate to the overview, the larger perspective. These were other periods of time with specific work to be done under the larger arc of time. So the very first plans of ages were a little more simplistic than this. But this is the one that I grew up with, and this is the one that we had studies with. So Barbour and Russell met at Russell's bequest. I said bequest. Behest. I was going to say request and behest, and I came out with bequest, which is a totally different thing. Sorry. At Russell's request, they met, and Russell paid the fare of Nelson Barbour. Barbour was always short of funds, and Russell was the money guy. Russell eventually sold his businesses and devoted himself full-time to religion. And I guess he had a fair chunk of money, somewhere in the neighborhood of $300,000, which would be, moderately wealthy today. I mean, that would translate into, I don't know, $7 to $10 million, something like that. I don't know what the exact exchange rate would be, but it would be sort of in that neighborhood. But it took Russell's focus off of business and directed it entirely and totally into his fanaticism of religion. And he and Barbour collaborated for a while, and most of the chronology that Russell promoted in his life really originated with Barbour. You see, Russell never was that much of an original thinker. He took ideas from different individuals, or that originated with different individuals. That's why when you see Charles Taze Russell and his influences, you see people like Henry Grew. I don't think Russell ever met Grew, but Grew had different ideas that made their way to Russell, and so they are considered influencing Russell. George Storrs definitely met Russell. Stetson was an influence of Russell. He was part of the study group. And I think Russell's sister was one of the original 5 in the study group. And so right around 1876 is when Nelson Barbour and Russell collaborated. There's a very interesting thing. When you go to Watchtower, and I have, if you watch Lloyd Evans' film, video he made a year ago about his visit to Watchtower headquarters in Warwick, I was there with him. I got to meet Lloyd that day, and I got to meet his wife. She's a lovely person, and his daughter. The 4 of us took the tour. My wife unfortunately couldn't come. She was recovering from a pretty invasive operation, but anyway, we spent an entire rainy June afternoon at Watchtower headquarters. And the thing that we noticed, the part that both of us really felt was very the most interesting. They had a facsimile of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Who wants a facsimile of that? Um, they had a whole bunch of old Bibles. I mean, I've seen a lot of Bibles in my time. So, that didn't excite me. What was interesting to me was the history that they weave together, which is quite biased. Again, Watchtower has to legitimize itself, and so it presents its history in a very specific way. So the first thing you do is you walk in to this exhibit, a little museum that they have, and there's a couple of exhibits in there. The one that has some, I guess, a cloak or overcoat of Russell's, his top hat, and his cane with a big golden handle, and they have that behind a glass case. They have a very old chart of the ages with a blue field, and the arcs and all of the time elements are in white. I guess they call that a batik or something like that. It's screened, silk screening or something. I don't know what but it was a very old chart. I don't know. The chart was missing a lot from what I just showed you. For instance, it didn't have the tabernacle. It also didn't have the pyramid in it. And I wish I could show you that movie image that I had taken of the Chart of the Ages at Watchtower, but I'm afraid I didn't keep it because it wasn't really very high quality. It was a poor video, so I think I just erased it with the idea in mind that I would go back sometime and get a better video. And I haven't gone back. That's the thing. Barbour and Russell collaborated for a couple of years and began to have a falling out on the doctrine of the ransom. Now, the ransom to Russell was a fundamental doctrine, and to Bible students, it continues to be the cornerstone doctrine. That as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. And that Jesus was sent as a substitution to Adam, that it required the balance of justice to meet God's perfect justice requirements. It took a perfect life to redeem a perfect life, and so the ransom involves Jesus offering his life to God as a substitute in punishment for Adam's transgression. And Jesus was made into a man and suffered and died as an exchange for Adam's life. This meant that Adam was freed from the sentence of death, redeemed in essence by the blood of Christ. And so Adam and Eve, who fell into the transgression with her husband, were released from the sentence of death. But in God's wisdom, he would not release Adam and Eve and humanity from this prison of death and sin and sickness until humankind has had sufficient lesson in the permission of evil. And then God would restore all things in his 1,000-year kingdom. And that's basically the plan of God in a nutshell. And so the ransom was a key thing, and the resurrection of Adam and Eve was a key doctrine. And through Adam and Eve, them being redeemed, thus the world of mankind, or humankind, were also redeemed in Adam. As in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. And that that Christ was the second Adam. First man Adam failed, and the second man Adam redeemed and ransomed. And so that was a big problem between Russell and Nelson Barbour, who did not see Adam or Jesus as a substitution to Adam. And they're, when you stop and you think about all of this business about, redemption and the plan, I mean, the whole idea of Adam and Eve and Jesus coming down to redeem Adam, ransom Adam, pay the price for Adam. I mean, it's all so elaborate and complicated and unnecessary. Why would God do that? If he were willing, let's put it this way, there had to be an option. One option would be Adam and Eve never sinned, and if they didn't sin, they would have populated the world with theoretically perfect people, because they were perfect. In theory, they were made perfect by God, according to Russell. But that didn't happen. They disobeyed, thus sin entered into humankind and has been passed down like a genetic trait from generation to generation, and every man dies. And so if that hadn't happened, humankind could have propagated perfectly forever, in theory. And so there's a problem there. If that alternative, which was God's apparent first alternative, was acceptable, if it was something that was viable, that creation could occur in that manner, that Adam and Eve could bring forth perfect progeny and thus populate the world with perfect humans, then why the need for thousands and thousands of years of immeasurable pain and suffering and torture that the poor human race has had to undergo before God finally blesses them in his 1,000-year kingdom and redeems them and restores them to their original condition. That's another doctrine. Restoration is a key doctrine of the Bible students. So the ransom for Russell was a big deal. And I could understand Barbour's questioning this. Why the need? Why do you need to burn the baby's hands on the stove to teach them a lesson? And so Barbour didn't buy into Russell's concept. Russell had the money, and he cut off Barbour. And when you go to the when you go to the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society's exhibits, there's no mention of Nelson Barbour whatsoever. He did not exist. They have George Storrs, they have Henry Grew, they have George Stetson. They have a number of individuals in a line of succession behind Russell as being the key influences on Russell. And Barbour is missing. And Barbour was probably the most important person because if it wasn't for Barbour, first off, they collaborated on a book and they published it. And secondly, he got most of his chronology from Barbour. And he kept that chronology. He didn't dispense with the chronology when he dispensed with Barbour. So like it or not, Barbour was an influence and a strong influence on Russell. He, to the day he died, believed in the chronology that Barbour introduced to him, which was that Christ came in 1874 invisibly, and that 1914 would mark the end of the times of Gentiles, but also the world as we know it. All institutions, and Armageddon would begin, and the world would, as we know it, would come to an end, and the kingdom would begin. And the 144,000 would be complete, and the harvest for the 144,000 would be complete. So, anyway, those were all concepts that were introduced to Russell by Barbour. The whole second volume really was influenced by Barbour. So it's interesting that the Watchtower just omits him whatsoever. As far as I know, the bitterness between Russell and Barbour was so strong that there wasn't even any mention about Barbour's death when he passed away. When George Storrs passed away, he was identified by Russell as Brother Storrs and mentioned in the Watchtower as having passed on to his heavenly reward. Now Russell, apparently Storrs died about the year Russell began the Watchtower. But when Russell and Barbour parted ways and Russell just cut the checkbook from Barbour and let him go his own way, Russell began his own publication that he called Zion's Watchtower. And in that first publication, he explains the split and why the split, because he was distributing to the subscription list of the Herald. I think it was Herald of the Morning or something like that. That was Barbour's paper, and that it was his magazine, and Russell was supporting and was on the flag staff of the magazine. And so Russell, when he cut ties, he was mailing to the same distribution list as Barbour's, and really was competing for members, and really stole. It was kind of dirty politics, really. But Russell took quite a large number of individuals from who had been gathered really originally by Barbour, and they formed the nucleus of the Bible students. But pretty quickly after 1879, there were 30 Bible student ecclesias that popped up in the northeastern region. I believe Ohio and New York and Pennsylvania certainly, and that meant that there was quite a bit of strong interest in what Russell had to say, And they formed these study groups pretty quickly after 1879, and Russell would tour these little groups. One of Barbour's early associates, John Patton, it was John Patton, was a key figure and representing Russell in the very early years. He toured a lot of these early Bible student ecclesias. They called the congregation an ecclesia. That's a Bible student nomenclature, or a class, a congregation, an ecclesia. They never used the word congregation. And when I grew up, it was either I grew up in the New York class or the New York ecclesia. Those were meant to be understood as the same thing. And it was also around 1879 that Mariah, I understand it was pronounced Mariah, even though it was spelled Maria, Ackley married Charles Russell. And I forget how old Russell was then. Let's see, in 1879, he would have been about 27 years old. And Mariah was older than Russell by several years, but she was a school teacher. She was literate. Russell's education only went to 7th grade, and he stopped. And that wasn't uncommon in those days. The education wasn't really that compulsory in those days. You could, because of the nature of life, be put to work as a child. There were no child labor laws back then, and so a 10-year-old, 11-year-old could work a job an adult normally works today. So Russell was a child when he started working, and he never really got an education. 7th grade was as far as it went. Now I heard and read, but I don't know of anything that really substantiates any of this. I do know that Maria, I'll call her Maria, had a significant influence in the Watchtower's early beginnings. She was literate. I understand that she if she didn't write the first 4 volumes, she edited them very heavily, and she was quite influential from that point of view. So she was involved. She was actually a director of the Watch when they incorporated the Watchtower in 1884. The Watchtower's first president was William Connelly, who was an early a person with early interest. He and his wife, they held meetings in their home. He was a millionaire. He was an industrialist and worked in the connected with the steel industry. And Connelly also was a philanthropist and was very interested in religion. And so Russell met, and his study group met in Allegheny at the Connelly's home. And Connelly, I guess Russell was playing some of the politics a little bit. Connelly having more money than Russell, he was a bigger fish than Russell. He was trying to schmooze him, I think, a little bit and see if he would be willing to financially support some of the work that he had envisioned. So thus, Connelly became president, He was president only for a very short time, and then Russell and Connelly parted ways. Connelly supported some other Christian group financially. Russell objected because they were the only one. He was the only one with the truth, and so they pulled away from one another. And Russell went on his own, and at that point, he became the president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. Now, Maria, I believe, was treasurer for a while. And she, now that's easy enough to check, and from corporate records and stuff, I'd have to verify that. I'm a little hazy on that. I know that she was on the board of directors. There's no question about that. I do believe that she had been treasurer for a while. Maria was very instrumental in its early beginnings, the society's early beginnings, and enthusiastically supporting her husband and his specialness. I understand from what I've read that if she didn't originate the idea, she did support the idea that Russell was the Laodicean messenger, or that wise and faithful servant. So that's how all that got started in the Watchtower Society, this business about who is the wise and faithful servant. They're still talking about it today. They just had a doctrinal change that made the governing body the wise and faithful servant. They call it the faithful and discreet slave, but it's the same scriptures, just using the Watchtower's new Bible language, the faithful and discreet slave. That's the same thing, the wise and faithful servant. And the movement began to get traction. Russell began to his published sermons were becoming published in newspapers across the country, and he was starting to make a name for himself. Actually, by the turn of the century, he was probably the most well-known religious leader in the United States, possibly the world, but in the United States certainly. They formed the Bible House for doing the publishing work and literature work in Allegheny. It was all centered in Allegheny until about 1909, when they decided that they needed to move to the center of everything, which was New York City. And so they moved their operations from Allegheny, their headquarters, from Allegheny to New York City, which required them to set up a separate corporation called the People's Pulpit. And then the Bible students were incorporated there. The Watchtower was incorporated there under that corporate identity, and it began to grow from that point on. Russell began taking world tours, but most of his beliefs and doctrines had been pretty well formulated by the time the Watchtower magazine began. There were some doctrinal shifts as late as the 1909, when I believe that was about the year when Russell changed his teachings, or maybe clarified his teachings on the covenants, which caused division. Actually, the first schism within the movement happened over the covenants, because for 40 years or 30 years he had taught that the church was under the new covenant, and Now he was no longer teaching that. It was a more complicated teaching, and but the majority of the movement stayed with him. He was a little worried about that. Apparently, what the effects of this change was going to have on the movement. Um, he didn't take dissent well. He disfellowshipped those who objected. I mean, after all, he did teach this thing for uh, the majority of his life, and then suddenly he changes it only 6, 7 years before he died. And so the teachings on the covenants, that was a major shift, and that also marked a change in the society itself because it began to show intolerance. Uh, Before that time, there wasn't any real schism, not from a doctrinal point of view. There were troubles within. I believe around 1894 there was an internal rebellion about Russell's autocratic nature. I mean, after all, he funded all of it, really, but there were some that rebelled about his authority. That was quashed. That was quelled pretty quickly. But in 1909, there were a significant number of Bible students that objected to this change in the doctrines over the covenants, and so Russell actually was worried about the degree to which a schism would occur within the movement, and it didn't happen as badly as he thought, but there were still quite a number, hundreds or so, of Bible students that left because of this change, and he disfellowshipped them. McPhail was one of the key dissenters who had close ties to Russell initially. The same with Hennignes, who married the controversial Rose Ball, the Rose Ball controversy, which was brought out during the divorce of Russell from his wife Maria. That was a sad part of history because it gave Watchtower's history because it gave some insight into Russell's misogyny, at least his growing misogyny. He was changing. He was a person that was changing. At first, he was willing to give Maria a great deal of liberty and surprising amount of autonomy and authority within the movement. But when the movement began to grow, there were a number of people, quite a number of men, who objected to having a woman with so much, so high in the organization, actually being involved in the organization, and this really affected Russell, and so he basically capitulated to this pressure and became increasingly misogynistic against his wife. She didn't like that. She was he called it poisoned by the suffragette movement, and in their divorce proceedings, it was apparent that there was quite a bit of bitterness between the two. He did not treat her well, but fortunately she managed to get herself a good lawyer and was able to secure some alimony from him, even though it wasn't a full divorce. It was a divorce from bed and board. She didn't really have provable, demonstrable allegations of of his being untrue. So, she didn't push the issue. She was smart enough not to push that end of it, although she did bring it out in court. Statements like the jellyfish, infamous jellyfish statement. I float around from this one and that one and touch them, and if they respond, then I react to them. And that's not an exact quote, but it kind of gets the sentiment across. And his relationship with his stepdaughter or foster daughter, Rose Ball, was questionable, if we could believe what Maria had to say about it, which probably I don't see why she had anything to lose. She could have destroyed Russell, but she didn't do that. She basically faded into the background. She was gone once the divorce was settled. She was basically gone, and she didn't cause him any more trouble. And he was pretty much a lot of people didn't know Russell was married. He was married almost 20 years. It wasn't a happy marriage, and it was platonic. In fact, there were a lot of Bible students who used that as a model for their relationships, and I'll talk about that a little later. It's kind of weird and sick, but Bible students used Russell's marriage, platonic marriage, as a model for their marriages, and it never works out very well. I mean, so anyway, sex always gets in the way, or the lack of sex. This is, from a doctrinal point of view, again, most of the doctrines were pretty well formulated. There were some key changes that were made, but Russell's idea of salvation, God's plan of the ages, was pretty simple, even though he wrote hundreds of thousands of words on the topic. Basically, it was that mankind fell into sin, deceived by the devil, tainted with sin, became imperfect, and gave rise to an imperfect race of children who subsequently, from generation to generation, passed on their imperfections to one another, and that this original idea of humankind being perfect and living forever was spoiled by Satan, who had turned Adam and Eve against God, disobeyed. Thus they had to pay the penalty. But then God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son to redeem, as a ransom price, a perfect life for a perfect life, Adam, and Eve was a part of Adam. The two twain were one flesh. So Jesus' sacrifice covered both, and once Jesus paid the price on the cross, then humankind was redeemed, but only in God's due time. That in the interim, God had another work, which was to gather together a little flock. And this little flock was the 144,000 mentioned in Revelation 7, and the work of what Russell denoted as the gospel age, which began with Jesus and his ministry and ends at the beginning of the millennium, is the period of time in which this 144,000 are selected by God. They're given the truth, or at least sufficient knowledge of the truth from God, so that they meet the criteria, developed the characters necessary to be part of the 144,000. That there were 2 periods of time designated a special time of harvest, while the selection for the 144,000 has been throughout this period of time from Jesus to the beginning of the kingdom. That there were actually the age, or the span of the age, was punctuated at the beginning and the end with a harvest. So there was a harvest work that was begun by the apostles, who established Christian classes, ecclesias throughout the Mediterranean region, and eventually these became corrupted, and error, Satan corrupted them. Error was introduced, and there was a long period of darkness that intervened, where there were individuals here and there selected by God to bring out important aspects of truth key to that time. Russell picked people like, I think, Tyndale and Martin Luther, and Arius, I think, was one, and he called these messengers, the 7. He equated them with the 7 messengers of Revelation. And Russell was the last messenger, the 7th trump, the final work, the final harvest, and that the work that Russell was doing was a harvest work of calling the remainders of the remnant of the 144,000 to the church. And when that harvest work was done, then the 144,000 would be complete, and they would be resurrected and raised to be exactly like God. That they would have what Russell called the divine nature, and the divine nature to Russell was God's nature, that God would make these individuals equivalent to him, and that he had done so with Jesus when Jesus was resurrected from the dead, that he resurrected Jesus to be like him, the same divine being. And according to Russell, divine meant cannot be killed. So once God raises someone to the divine nature, they cannot be killed. So in essence, God is no longer omnipotent once he has raised Jesus, and once he raised Jesus to that position, then God can't undo what he had done. That Jesus is omnipotent, or he cannot die. He is immortal, and he has no ability to die. So that is what the church is going to be raised to. So there is, in essence, 144,000 gods, in essence, and then once the call of the church is done, the 144,000 are complete. Then begins the 1,000-year kingdom. God ends this world through the means of Armageddon, destroys all the institutions of this world, captures Satan and binds Satan, throws him down into the bottomless pit, and for 1,000 years, God rules in his 1,000-year kingdom, actually placing Jesus as the king over this kingdom and the church. The church will be kings and priests, and they will rule with Jesus as co-rulers during this 1,000-year period, and teach the world the law of God. it says that he will write in their hearts a new law, and none will have to say no God, because all would know him, and he will write his law in their hearts and in their minds. And so that's the work of the church during the 1,000-year kingdom, is to resurrect the billions and billions of people who had ever lived, from Adam to those that died in Armageddon. We got a helicopter here I'm competing with. Boy, he's flying low. Sometimes they fly pretty low over that lake. Let's say he's at about 500 feet. Jeez. Sorry about that. Anyway, so these are the 1,000 years. All of humankind is resurrected and taught the law of God. None shall be allowed to hurt. Everybody will have the opportunity to be perfect. It's going to be a paradise. Animals will no longer harm humans, and no more carnivorous creatures. That was all part of the original sin and the fall from grace. And the lion shall literally lay down with the lamb. They will eat straw. It's, this strange, weird picture that the Jehovah's Witnesses give, that Bible students have the same idea. It's where the witnesses got it from the Bible students. And so at the end of the 1,000 years, God lets Satan out again as a final test of humankind, how well the law was written in their hearts. And there's this big rebellion they call the little season. Satan gathers the forces of Gog and Magog around the earth at the end of the 1,000 years. And it says, they will be as the numbers as the sands of the sea, and they will encamp, they will take siege the city of God and the camp of the saints. And then fire comes down from God and destroys them all. And all those that aligned with God and Jesus in the little season will live forever in perfect happiness on earth, and the rest will be destroyed forever, symbolically by the lake of fire, thrown in the lake of fire, which represents destruction, not a literal hell of torment. And that's when New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven, and God rules the world forever. And so that's basically what Bible students, what Russell taught in a nutshell. And salvation would be offered to all. And people who died in Armageddon, which was, to Russell, a period of social chaos, a disintegration of governments, of church, state, and financial institutions, and God would then set up a kingdom. The idea of Armageddon has evolved a little bit with Bible students with the advent of modern nuclear weapons. Now Bible students believe that the ultimate destruction of the world, they take very literally the scripture in Matthew, lest those days be shortened, no flesh should be saved, but those days will be shortened, taken to mean that God's going to end the world. I mean, the Armageddon would mean the end of all life on earth had not God intervened. But the thing is that all humans will have a chance for life, and that's the teaching of the Bible students, that as in Adam all die, even and so in Christ all shall be made alive. So all will have a chance to live. Armageddon isn't a period of judgment of 7.5 billion people. It's a judgment of institutions and religions and everything that spells Satan's world. That's what's destroyed. There may be some humans destroyed in the process that die because it's a time of war, a time of panic, a time of chaos. But these will gain a resurrection in the 1,000 years. And it's supposed to be a pretty devastating end because they have Ezekiel 38, where they're burying the dead for how many months, and so they take that literally. That's talking about the burying the dead from the destruction, the final destruction of Armageddon, and God's intervention when He destroys and sends fire upon the earth and destroys all the institutions. But everybody gets a chance to be resurrected because they were all bought by Jesus' ransom. So that's what the Bible students teach. That's what Russell taught. And that's when Russell died, those teachings were altered quite a bit by the individuals that took control over Watchtower after Russell died in 1916. Judge Rutherford spearheaded the movement, changed its direction, and altered doctrines. He was heavily supported by A.H. Macmillan and William Van Amberg, both officers of the Watchtower Society. Well, Van Amberg was an officer when Russell was alive, but Macmillan became a director after I don't think he ever became an officer of the Watchtower. I think he just remained a director, but he was highly influential. I don't think he ever held any kind of an office. He wasn't a vice president. He wasn't ever a president, and Macmillan never was the treasurer. So he was never an officer of the corporation, but he was highly influential, and he was a key figure in what happened to the Watchtower and the Bible students movement during the 20s and 1930s. So I brought you up to about the point in time, 1900, 1916, that period in there of the movement, and about the time when my family became involved with the Watchtower. My earliest family member was in the 1890s. My paternal grandmother's side of the family, she had an aunt who became a Bible student in 1896, and then her father, my great-grandpa Hickson, shortly thereafter became a Bible student. So we have heritage that goes back into the 1890s, Bible student heritage. But the rest of my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, who was born in 1889, joined the Bible students around 1908, and then my maternal great grandparents, they came over from Scotland in 1909, and that was the year they became Bible students. And my grandmother was a child at that time, but she was 6 in 1909, and by the time Russell died in 1916, she was about 13, 14 years old. And so she remembers a lot. She remembered a lot. She's no longer alive. And so that's about the period of time that I've kind of taken us to, right up to the time where Russell was no longer married. and had moved the Watchtower to Brooklyn. And so I'm going to leave it here at this point, and we'll pick it up from here. I know it's long. I'm sorry about that. But it's hard to bring a history of the Bible students and their beliefs um, in such a short, in a short period of time. But anyway, we'll move on. We'll talk about what some Bible students call the dark years in the next video. The dark years was that transition period where Rutherford took charge, and doctrines began to change. New light was introduced, and we began to see a transition into Jehovah's Witnesses. And we'll talk about that and the Reformation or reformation of the Bible students. It happened in spurts. There isn't just one Bible student movement, but there are several, and we'll talk about those. Right after Russell died, there were two that immediately broke off. One was called the Pastoral Bible Institute, and the other was Layman's Home Missionary. We'll mention them briefly. Then there was a group called the Standfasters, and then the Dawn Bible Students, and that's the group that I was born and raised in. So we'll talk about that in the next video. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the remainder of this day. Thank you.